I'm Rebecca Martinez, 33 years old, and 15 years ago my father threw me out of our home when he discovered a secret that would shatter our family forever. "How could you betray us like this?" he screamed, his face twisted with rage and disgust. What my family never understood was the devastating truth behind my decision. They chose judgment over compassion, pride over love. Now, after 15 years of complete silence, they're standing at my door. They have no idea what awaits them, how their worlds will crumble when they see what their cruelty created. Before I tell you my story, let me know where you're watching from. And please hit that like and subscribe button as I reveal how my family's faces went white when they saw what their rejection had cost them. I grew up in a tight-knit Catholic family in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. My father, Miguel Martinez, wasn't just any father. He was a respected businessman who owned 3 successful auto repair shops and served as a deacon at St. Michael's Cathedral. People in our community looked up to him, sought his advice, and considered him the epitome of family values and moral integrity. My mother, Carmen, embodied everything a traditional Catholic wife was supposed to be. She organized church fundraisers, kept our home immaculate, and never missed preparing Dad's coffee at exactly 5:30 a.m. before he left for work. Her tamales were legendary at church potlucks, and her rose garden was featured in the local newspaper twice. She had this warm, infectious laugh that made everyone feel welcome in our home. Then there was my older brother Diego, 3 years my senior, and the absolute golden boy of our family. Star soccer player, honor roll student, and already accepted to Arizona State University on an academic scholarship. Dad would practically burst with pride at Diego's games, his voice booming across the field. "Ese yes mi hijo," he would shout whenever Diego scored. I'd sit there beside him, invisible, always hoping for just a fraction of that enthusiasm directed toward me. Our life appeared perfect from the outside, the sprawling ranch-style home with the red tile roof, weekend barbacoas with extended family, daily mass attendance, and Sunday dinners that lasted for hours. We were the family others in our parish aspired to be. At least, that's what everyone believed. I was 18 when I met Daniel Ramirez in my freshman composition class at Arizona State. We were paired for a research project on social justice in literature. Daniel wasn't like the other college guys I knew. He was serious but gentle, with kind hazel eyes that seemed to see straight through all the pretense of college life. The first time we studied together at the library, we talked for 4 hours and barely touched our assignment. "You're different, Rebecca," he told me that day. "You care about things that matter." Daniel wasn't interested in typical college activities like partying or sports. While other students were focused on grades and social status, he was volunteering at a homeless shelter and writing poetry that made my heart race. He played the violin with such passion that I could feel every note resonate through my soul when he performed at campus recitals. We fell in love gradually, deeply, with the kind of intensity that seemed impossible for teenagers. We had so many plans together. Daniel was studying social work with dreams of opening a community center for at-risk youth. He'd already been accepted for a graduate program at Stanford with a full fellowship. I was majoring in elementary education, planning to teach in underserved communities. We talked about moving to California together after graduation, about the difference we could make in the world, about the family we'd create someday. Our relationship wasn't like most college romances. Physical intimacy wasn't something we rushed into. Both raised in strict Catholic families, we moved slowly, building something meaningful based on shared values and deep emotional connection. My parents approved of Daniel, or at least they approved of what they knew about him. He was respectful, academically excellent, and came from a good family. Dad would even joke that Daniel was the only boy he'd ever trusted with his daughter. Then, during our junior year, everything changed in a way that would test everything we believed about love, family, and faith. It started with Daniel becoming increasingly involved in immigration advocacy work. What began as volunteering at a legal aid clinic evolved into something much more serious when he discovered that several families in our community were facing deportation despite having lived in the United States for decades. Among these families was the Herrera family, Maria, a single mother of 3 young children who had been brought to the U.S. as a 5-year-old and had no memory of Mexico. She worked 2 jobs to support her family and had been trying to navigate the complex immigration system for years. When ICE began targeting her neighborhood, Daniel couldn't stand by and watch. "They're going to separate those children from their mother," he told me one night, his voice thick with emotion. "Kids who were born here, American citizens, and they'll be left alone while their mom gets deported to a country she doesn't even remember." I watched Daniel wrestle with what was right versus what was legal. The Herrera family had become like family to us. We'd spent countless hours helping the children with homework, teaching Maria English, and accompanying her to legal appointments. When Daniel learned that ICE was planning a raid on their apartment complex, he faced an impossible choice. "I can't let this happen," he said. "Not when I have the means to help." Daniel's plan was simple but dangerous. His family owned a small cabin in the mountains outside Flagstaff that had been abandoned for years. He would drive Maria and her children there, hiding them until their legal situation could be resolved through proper channels. It wasn't about circumventing the law permanently. It was about buying time for justice to work. I knew it was risky. I knew it could have serious consequences. But I also knew that doing nothing while a family was torn apart was morally unacceptable. When Daniel asked if I would help, my heart said yes before my mind could calculate the costs. We spent weeks planning every detail. The cabin needed to be stocked with food and supplies. We established a communication system that wouldn't be traceable. Most importantly, we created a cover story for why Daniel and I would be absent from campus for several days, a research trip to interview Native American elders for our respective thesis projects. The night before we were supposed to leave, Daniel took my hands in his and looked me directly in the eyes. "Once we do this, there's no going back," he said. "If we get caught, it won't just affect us. It could affect our families, our futures, everything we've planned." "Some things are more important than our plans," I replied. "This is one of them." What we didn't anticipate was how quickly everything would unravel. The drive to the cabin should have been routine. Maria and her 3 children, Sophia, 12, Carlos, 8, and baby Elena, just 18 months, were hidden in the back of Daniel's van, covered with camping equipment. I followed in my car with additional supplies. We'd made this trip twice before to prepare the cabin, and the route was familiar. But 15 miles outside of Phoenix, Daniel's van broke down on a remote stretch of highway. As I pulled over behind him, my heart sank. The engine had completely seized, steam pouring from under the hood. We were stranded with 4 undocumented people in the middle of nowhere, with no cell phone coverage and no way to continue our journey. While Daniel tried desperately to fix the van, Maria held baby Elena, who had developed a fever during the trip. Sophia and Carlos huddled together in the back, their eyes wide with fear. They understood enough about their situation to know that being discovered could mean losing their mother forever. After an hour of failed attempts to restart the van, we had to make a critical decision. We couldn't call for roadside assistance without risking exposure. We couldn't abandon the van without abandoning the family. And Elena's fever was getting worse. "We have to get Elena to a hospital," Maria said, her voice breaking. "Something's wrong." In that moment, standing on that empty highway with a sick baby and a broken-down van, I made a choice that would change my life forever. I called 911. When the paramedics arrived, followed closely by the police, there was no hiding what we were doing. The officer who responded was thorough and professional, but he had no choice but to follow protocol when he discovered 4 undocumented individuals in our possession. "I understand what you kids were trying to do," he told Daniel and me as he took our statements. "But this is a federal matter now. I have to report it." Within hours, we were in federal custody. Maria and her children were transferred to a detention facility while Daniel and I were charged with human trafficking, a felony that carried a potential sentence of up to 20 years in prison. The irony was devastating. In trying to keep a family together, we had guaranteed their separation. In trying to help, we had made everything worse. The news of our arrest spread through Phoenix like wildfire. Local college students charged in human trafficking ring, read the headline in the Arizona Republic. The story painted us as criminals, smugglers who had exploited vulnerable people for profit. Nothing could have been further from the truth, but truth rarely matters in the initial wave of scandal. The call to my parents came at 3 a.m. I was allowed one phone call from the federal holding facility, and I chose to call home, hoping to explain the situation before they heard it from the media. "Dad," I said when he answered, his voice groggy with sleep, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully." "Rebecca? Where are you?" "It's 3 in the morning. I'm in federal custody," I said, the words feeling surreal as they left my mouth. Daniel and I were arrested for helping a family avoid deportation. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my mother in the background asking what was wrong, could hear my father's sharp intake of breath. "What do you mean, federal custody?" he finally asked, his voice deadly calm. I tried to explain quickly about the Herrera family, about the children who would be left alone, about the moral obligation we felt to help. But before I could finish, my father interrupted. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he said, his voice rising. "Do you understand what this means for our family? Dad, if you could just meet them, see what they're going through, dash." "I don't want to hear it," he cut me off. "You've destroyed everything. Everything we've worked for, everything we've built in this community. How am I supposed to face the congregation? How am I supposed to continue serving as a deacon when my own daughter is a criminal?" The word hit me like a physical blow. Criminal. Not someone who made a mistake, not someone who was trying to help, but a criminal. "I'm still your daughter," I whispered. "No," he said, his voice cold as ice. "My daughter would never have brought this shame on our family. Don't call here again." The line went dead. That was the last conversation I had with my father for 15 years. The legal battle that followed was a nightmare. Daniel and I were fortunate to have a skilled attorney who understood the moral complexity of our case, but the law was clear about what we had done. Despite character witnesses, despite evidence of our good intentions, despite the fact that we had acted out of compassion rather than greed, we were looking at serious federal charges. The prosecutor offered us a plea deal, 3 years in federal prison in exchange for guilty pleas to reduce charges. Our attorney advised us to take it, warning that if we went to trial and lost, we could face decades behind bars. "This isn't justice," Daniel said during one of our meetings with a lawyer. "We were trying to help a family." "I understand that," our attorney replied gently. "But the court system isn't always concerned with moral justice. Sometimes it's about legal justice, and legally, you broke federal law." 3 days before we were supposed to enter our pleas, something unexpected happened. The case began receiving national media attention from immigration advocacy groups. Our story was picked up by CNN, the New York Times, and other major outlets. Suddenly, we weren't just local criminals. We were symbols of a larger debate about immigration policy and moral civil disobedience. The attention brought support we never expected. A legal defense fund was established that raised enough money for us to hire a more experienced attorney who specialized in immigration law. Character witnesses came forward from across the country, professors, clergy members, civil rights activists who argued that what we had done was morally justified even if legally questionable. Most importantly, the media attention led to a thorough investigation of the Herrera family's case. It was discovered that Maria should have been eligible for protection under asylum laws that had been misapplied by the original immigration judge. Her case was reopened, and she was eventually granted legal residency. This development changed everything about our situation. Our new attorney argued successfully that our actions, while technically illegal, had ultimately led to a correction of an injustice in the immigration system. The judge, noting our clean records, the support of the community, and the positive outcome for the family we had tried to help, sentenced us to community service and probation instead of prison time. Daniel and I each received 1,000 hours of community service and 3 years of probation. We were also required to complete our college degrees and maintain employment. It was a fair sentence given the circumstances, and we were grateful to avoid prison. But while the legal system showed us mercy, my family did not. Throughout the entire ordeal, the arrest, the media coverage, the legal proceedings, my family remained completely silent. They didn't visit me in jail, didn't attend the court hearings, didn't respond to my letters or phone calls. It was as if I had ceased to exist. I learned through mutual friends that my father had immediately resigned from his position as deacon, claiming he could no longer serve in good conscience given his daughter's actions. The family stopped attending St. Michael's Cathedral altogether, switching to a parish across town where they weren't known. Diego, my brother, was caught in the middle. Friends told me he wanted to reach out but was forbidden by our parents. When reporters contacted the family for comment, they issued a brief statement saying they had no relationship with Rebecca Martinez and would not be discussing the matter further. The rejection was absolute and devastating. Daniel's family, while also deeply troubled by our actions, eventually came to understand our motivations. His parents visited us in jail, attended our court hearings, and worked to support us through the legal process. The contrast between his family's response and mine was painful and stark. "They'll come around," Daniel would tell me during our long conversations about the future. "When the dust settles, when they see that we did the right thing, they'll understand." But I wasn't so sure. I knew my father's pride, his rigid sense of right and wrong, his concern for reputation, and standing in the community. What we had done wasn't just a legal mistake in his eyes. It was a betrayal of everything he had taught me about respecting authority and following rules. As our community service began and we worked to rebuild our lives, Daniel and I grew even closer. The shared experience of facing such serious consequences together, of standing by our principles even when it cost us everything, had forged a bond between us that felt unbreakable. We were assigned to work at the same homeless shelter where Daniel had originally volunteered, providing meals and support services to Phoenix's most vulnerable population. The irony wasn't lost on us. We were being punished by being required to help people, which was exactly what had gotten us in trouble in the first place. But it was meaningful work. Every day, we saw the faces of people who had been forgotten by society, who had fallen through the cracks of systems that were supposed to protect them. Many were immigrants, legal and illegal, who were struggling to build lives in a country that didn't always welcome them. Our experience with the Herrera family had given us insights that helped us serve this population more effectively. 6 months into our community service, Daniel proposed to me in the shelter's community garden, surrounded by tomato plants and volunteer sunflowers. It wasn't the romantic proposal most girls dream of, but it was perfect for us, rooted in the work we shared, the values we held, and the future we wanted to build together. "I want to spend my life with you," he said, slipping a simple silver band onto my finger. "Not despite what we've been through, but because of it. You're the only person I've ever met who would risk everything for a stranger's family." We planned a small wedding for the following spring, after our legal troubles were fully resolved. It would be a simple ceremony, just close friends and Daniel's family. I had long since stopped hoping my own family would be present. 3 weeks before the wedding, everything changed again. Daniel had been experiencing persistent headaches and fatigue, which we attributed to the stress of the past year. But when he collapsed during our shift to the shelter, I knew something was seriously wrong. The emergency room doctor's initial assessment was concerning but not alarming, possibly dehydration, maybe a mild concussion from the fall. But blood tests revealed something that changed our world forever. Daniel had acute lymphoblastic leukemia, an aggressive form of cancer that had already progressed significantly. "How long has he been having symptoms?" the oncologist asked me after explaining the diagnosis. I thought back over the past months, the headaches, the exhaustion, the bruising I'd attributed to his clumsiness. "Maybe 3 months," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "If we'd caught it earlier, the prognosis would be better," the doctor explained gently. "But we're going to fight this aggressively. There are treatments available." The next few months became a blur of chemotherapy sessions, hospital visits, and desperate hope followed by crushing disappointment. Daniel faced his illness with the same moral courage he'd shown in helping the Herrera family, but his body wasn't responding to treatment the way we'd hoped. During one particularly difficult night in the hospital, as Daniel struggled with pain from his latest round of chemo, he brought up something we'd never seriously discussed. "I want to leave something behind," he said, gripping my hand with what little strength he had. "If I don't make it through this, I want there to be a part of me that continues." We talked for hours about what he meant, about the possibility of having a child together before he potentially died. It wasn't a decision we made lightly. We discussed every aspect, every concern, every hope. This wasn't recklessness or desperation. It was a profound response to mortality, a choice made from the deepest kind of love. When I discovered I was pregnant 2 months later, my emotions were a whirlwind of joy and terror. Joy that a part of Daniel would live on, terror about facing parenthood potentially alone, and an underlying certainty that we had created something beautiful in the midst of devastation. I planned to tell my parents after I figured out how to explain everything, not just the pregnancy, but Daniel's illness, our love, and why this child meant everything to us. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't about rebellion or poor choices, but about love and legacy in the face of losing everything. But before I could find the right words or the right moment, I received a call that shattered what remained of my world. Daniel had been rushed to the hospital after collapsing at his parents' home. By the time I arrived, he was unconscious, his body finally succumbing to the cancer that had ravaged him for months. I spent 3 days by his bedside, holding his hand and talking to him about our unborn child, about the life we'd planned, about how much he meant to me. On the third night, with the machines beeping their mechanical rhythm, Daniel squeezed my hand one last time and whispered, "Take care of our baby." Those were his last words. Daniel died on a Tuesday morning in March, just as the sun was rising over the mountains east of Phoenix. I was holding his hand when he took his last breath, and I felt as if a part of my soul went with him. The funeral was a blur of grief and regret. Daniel's parents, devastated by their loss, still found the strength to include me as family. "You were his wife in every way that mattered," his mother told me through her tears. "This baby is our grandchild, and you're our daughter now." But standing at the graveside, 6 months pregnant and overwhelmed by loss, I realized how truly alone I was in the world. Daniel's parents offered support, but they were struggling with their own grief and financial burden from his medical bills. Our friends from college were scattered, starting careers and lives in other cities. And my own family remained completely absent, even from his funeral. That night, sitting in the apartment Daniel and I had shared, I finally decided to reach out to my parents one more time. Maybe grief would soften their hearts. Maybe the prospect of their first grandchild would bridge the gap that my criminal behavior had created. I drove to my childhood home on a Sunday evening, knowing they would be home from evening Massachusetts. With trembling hands, I knocked on the front door of the house where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to ride a bike and celebrated birthdays and dreamed of my future. My mother answered the door. For a moment, seeing me standing there visibly pregnant, she seemed frozen. I saw recognition in her eyes, maybe even longing, but before she could speak, my father appeared behind her. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice cold as ice. "Dad, I'm pregnant," I said, placing a protective hand over my belly. "Daniel died last week from cancer. This is your grandchild." For just a moment, I thought I saw something flicker across his face, confusion, perhaps the beginning of understanding. But then his expression hardened. "We have no daughter," he said flatly, "and therefore no grandchild. You made your choice when you decided to become a criminal." "Please," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I need my family." "You should have thought about that before you brought shame on our name," he replied. Then he stepped back and closed the door in my face. I stood on that familiar porch for several minutes, my hand still pressed against my belly, promising my unborn child that somehow we would be okay. As I walked back to my car, I saw movement in the living room window, my mother's face, just for a second, before the curtain fell back into place. That was the last time I saw any member of my family for 15 years. The months that followed Daniel's death were the darkest of my life. I was grieving the loss of my soulmate while simultaneously preparing to bring new life into the world. The apartment Daniel and I had shared became too painful to stay in, filled with memories of plans that would never come to fruition. Daniel's parents, Thomas and Maria Ramirez, offered what support they could, but they were dealing with their own financial crisis. Daniel's medical bills had consumed their savings, and Thomas was forced to take early retirement due to his own health problems. They moved to a smaller apartment across town, and while they desperately wanted to help me, they simply didn't have the resources. I was forced to move back in with my college roommate, Sarah, who had graduated but was still living in Phoenix while working as a substitute teacher. She offered me her couch and unconditional support, but it was clearly a temporary solution. "You can't have a baby while sleeping on my couch," she told me practically. "We need to figure out a better plan." The problem was that I had very few options. My community service work at the homeless shelter provided valuable experience, but no income. I was surviving on the small life insurance policy Daniel had taken out when we got engaged, barely enough to cover basic expenses for a few months. I spent my days applying for jobs that would hire someone with a criminal record and my evenings completing my community service hours. The combination of pregnancy, grief, and financial stress was overwhelming. Some nights, I would lie awake on Sarah's couch, my hand on my growing belly, wondering how I was going to provide for this child alone. 2 months before my due date, I found work at a small nonprofit organization that provided services to immigrant families, essentially the same population Daniel and I had tried to help, though now through legal channels. The director, Elena Rodriguez, hired me despite my criminal record, saying that my experience gave me insights that would be valuable in the work. "Sometimes the people who understand injustice best are those who have faced it themselves," she told me during my interview. The job didn't pay much, but it came with health insurance that would cover the birth. More importantly, it gave me a sense of purpose during the darkest period of my life. Every family I helped, every child who found safety and stability through our services, felt like a way of honoring Daniel's memory and the choice we had made. My son, David Miguel Martinez Ramirez, was born on a snowy December morning, 6 weeks before his due date, but fighting hard to survive. He was small but healthy, with Daniel's dark hair and my brown eyes. The moment the doctor placed him in my arms, I felt a surge of love and determination unlike anything I'd ever experienced. "Hi, little one," I whispered to him as he slept against my chest. "Your daddy would have loved you so much." Thomas and Maria were there for the birth, crying tears of joy as they met their grandson. "He looks just like Daniel did as a baby," Maria said, gently touching David's tiny hand. But as I held my son in that hospital room, surrounded by Daniel's parents and Sarah, I was painfully aware of the absence of my own family. I had sent a birth announcement to my parents' address, including a photo of David in the blue blanket Maria had knitted. I never received a response. The early months of motherhood were a constant struggle between overwhelming love and crushing exhaustion. David was a good baby, but I was a single mother working full-time, while still completing community service hours on weekends. Sarah helped as much as she could, but she was starting her own teaching career and couldn't be my permanent support system. When David was 4 months old, everything changed again. Elena Rodriguez called me into her office with news that seemed too good to be true. "We've received a grant to expand our family services program," she explained. "I want you to head up the new initiative. It would mean a significant raise and the opportunity to develop programs from the ground up. The position would allow me to use my experience, both personal and professional, to help families facing immigration challenges." It was exactly the kind of work Daniel and I had dreamed of doing together, and it paid enough for me to finally achieve true independence. With my new salary, I was able to move David and myself into a small but comfortable apartment. For the first time since Daniel's death, I began to envision a future that wasn't just about survival, but about building something meaningful. As David grew, it became clear that he had inherited more than just his father's looks. He was exceptionally bright, speaking in full sentences before his 2nd birthday and showing an early aptitude for music. By age 3, he was picking out melodies on the small keyboard I'd bought him at a thrift store. I enrolled him in a preschool that had a music program, watching with pride and heartbreak as he demonstrated the same natural talent that had made his father so special. Sometimes, watching David play, I could almost feel Daniel's presence beside me, sharing in our son's accomplishments. My career continued to advance as well. The family services program I developed became a model for other organizations across the state. I was invited to speak at conferences, consulted on policy initiatives, and eventually offered the position of executive director when Elena retired. By the time David was 7, we had moved into a modest house in a good school district. It wasn't extravagant, but it was ours, the first real home I'd had since being thrown out of my parents' house. David had his own room, a backyard to play in, and a piano in the living room where he could practice the compositions he was already beginning to create. The success felt surreal sometimes. From federal criminal to nonprofit executive director, from homeless pregnant girl to homeowner, from abandoned daughter to proud mother. I had built a life from nothing, driven by love for my son and determination to honor the memory of the man who should have been building it with me. But success couldn't fill the hole left by family rejection. Every milestone in David's life, his first steps, his first day of school, his first piano recital, was tinged with sadness that his grandparents, uncle, and extended family were missing it all by choice. When David was 10, he began asking more pointed questions about my family. "Why don't I have grandparents like my friends do?" he asked one day after returning from a classmate's birthday party. "You do have grandparents," I told him carefully. They made different choices about how to be in our lives." "Are they mad at me?" he asked, his young face serious with concern. "No, sweetheart," I assured him, pulling him close. "They're not mad at you. They don't even know you, which is their loss because you're the most amazing kid in the world." As David entered middle school, his musical talent became impossible to ignore. His piano teacher recommended that he audition for a prestigious youth conservatory program in Phoenix. The audition process was rigorous, but David's natural ability and the compositions he'd been creating impressed the admissions committee. He was accepted with a full scholarship. The conservatory program required a significant time commitment, 3 afternoons a week plus Saturday classes. It meant adjusting my work schedule and arranging elaborate carpools, but seeing David's joy and growth made every sacrifice worthwhile. At his first conservatory recital, I sat in the audience watching my 12-year-old son perform a piece he'd written himself, a haunting melody he'd titled Letter to Dad. There wasn't a dry eye in the house when he finished, and I felt Daniel's presence so strongly it took my breath away. After the recital, as I was congratulating David and talking with other parents, a woman approached me hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said, "are you Rebecca Martinez?" I tensed, always wary when strangers recognized my name. The criminal case from years ago still appeared in internet searches, and I never knew how people would react to that information. "Yes," I said carefully. "I'm Janet Williams from the Arizona Republic," she said. "I've been following your work with immigrant families, and I'd love to do a feature story about your nonprofit and how your own experiences shaped your advocacy." I was reluctant at first. The last thing I wanted was to bring negative attention to the organization or to David. But Janet was persistent, and eventually I agreed to a limited interview focused on my current work rather than my past legal troubles. The resulting article, published on a Sunday in March, was more comprehensive than I had expected. It told the story of my transformation from college student convicted of human trafficking to award-winning advocate for immigrant families. It featured photos of David at his piano and discussed how my experiences as a single mother had influenced my understanding of family separation issues. The article was largely positive, portraying my legal troubles as youthful idealism rather than criminal behavior. It focused on the work I was doing now, the families I was helping, and the innovative programs I had developed. The headline read, "From Controversy to Community: How One Woman's Mistakes Led to a Life of Service." I never expected anyone from my past to see the article. It had been 15 years since I'd had any contact with my family, and I'd learned to live as if they simply didn't exist. But 3 days after the article was published, I received an email that made my hands shake as I read it. The sender was Diego Martinez, my brother. "Rebecca," it began, "I saw the article in the Republic. I've wanted to reach out for years, but didn't know how. Mom and Dad saw it too. Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a long time, emotions warring within me. Anger at 15 years of silence, curiosity about what had finally prompted contact, fear about allowing people who had hurt me so deeply back into our lives, and underneath it all, a small voice of the girl who had once desperately wanted her family's love and approval. After several days of consideration and lengthy discussions with my therapist, a support system I'd maintained throughout my journey, I responded to Diego. I agreed to a phone conversation, but I was clear that any relationship moving forward would need to acknowledge what had happened and respect the life I'd built without them. The phone call was awkward and emotional. Diego, now married with children of his own, explained that he had wanted to contact me many times over the years, but had been forbidden by our parents. He told me that our father had suffered a stroke the previous year, a health scare that had forced him to confront his own mortality and the relationships he'd damaged. He talks about you sometimes now, Diego said quietly, when he thinks no one is listening. He asks questions about you, about whether you're okay, if you ever had children. And what do you tell him? I asked, surprised by the bitterness in my own voice. I tell him I don't know, Diego admitted. Because you made it clear 15 years ago that we weren't family anymore. The irony wasn't lost on me. Now my brother was claiming I had been the one to end the relationship, conveniently forgetting that I had been the one thrown out, the one whose phone calls went unanswered, the one who had been told she was no longer a daughter. But I also heard something else in Diego's voice, genuine regret and a desire to repair what had been broken. We arranged for my parents to visit our home the following month. I spent weeks preparing, not just the house but myself and David as well. I explained to my son, now 13 and old enough to understand complex family dynamics, about the grandparents he had never met and why they had been absent from our lives. Are they bad people? He asked with typical teenage directness. No, I answered after careful thought. They're people who made very hurtful choices because they were afraid and stuck in old ways of thinking. But people can change, and we're going to see if they have. As the day of their visit approached, I alternated between anxiety and a strange sense of calm. The life I had built was solid, successful, and fulfilling. Whatever happened with my family of origin, David and I would be okay. This realization gave me a strength I hadn't possessed during our last encounter, the strength that comes from knowing your own worth. The day my family was scheduled to visit, I found myself rearranging the living room for the third time, polishing surfaces that were already spotless, and checking the clock obsessively. David watched my nervous energy with amusement. "Mom, the house is perfect," he said, placing his hand on my arm. "And so are we." His maturity at 13 sometimes took my breath away. He'd had to grow up understanding complex adult situations from an early age, aware of our family history and the absence of traditional grandparent relationships. Rather than making him bitter, these challenges had fostered in him an extraordinary empathy and wisdom. At exactly 2 p.m., a car pulled into our driveway. From the window, I watched my parents and brother emerge, their movements hesitant as they took in the modest but well-maintained exterior of our home. My father looked dramatically older than his 67 years, walking with a cane and moving slowly. The stroke had clearly taken its toll. My mother appeared smaller and more fragile than I remembered, though she still carried herself with the same dignified posture I recalled from childhood. "They're here," I said to David, who sat at the piano, his fingers nervously running through scales. "Should I play something?" he asked, his voice smaller than usual. "Just be yourself," I told him, squeezing his shoulder. "That's more than enough." The doorbell rang, and I took a deep breath before opening it. There they stood, my parents and Diego, looking uncertain and older than I had imagined. For a moment, we all just stared at each other, 15 years of silence hanging heavy in the air. "Rebecca," my mother whispered, her eyes immediately filling with tears. My father stood behind her, leaning heavily on his cane, his face a mixture of pride and regret as he took in my appearance. No longer the frightened 18-year-old he had banished, but a confident woman who had clearly built a successful life. "Please come in," I said, stepping aside. As they entered the living room, their eyes immediately went to the piano where David sat. He stood up politely, all 5 feet 8 inches of him, and I saw my father's breath catch. The resemblance to Daniel was unmistakable, but there were Martinez features there too, the strong jawline, the thick dark hair, the intelligent eyes. "Mom, Dad, Diego," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, this is David, your grandson and nephew." David stepped forward and extended his hand with the same quiet confidence Daniel had possessed. "It's nice to meet you," he said simply. My mother broke down completely. "Oh, Mijo," she sobbed, reaching out tentatively to touch his face. "You're so beautiful. You look just like your mama did at your age." My father remained frozen, staring at David as if seeing a ghost. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "You play piano?" "Yes, sir," David replied. "I compose music too. Would you like to hear something?" Without waiting for an answer, David sat back down and began to play the piece he'd written called Letter to Dad. The haunting melody filled the room, and I watched as understanding dawned on my parents' faces. This wasn't just their grandson. This was a remarkably talented young man who had grown up without them, who had been shaped by experiences they knew nothing about. When the music ended, my father was crying, something I had never seen in my childhood. "Forgive me," he whispered, but he wasn't looking at David. His eyes were on me. "Forgive me, Mija." I was so afraid of what people would think, so caught up in my pride, that I threw away the most important thing in my life. My daughter. The words I had waited 15 years to hear. I read the article. My mother said through her tears, "All these years, we thought you had ruined your life. But you built something beautiful. You've helped so many families. You raised this incredible boy all alone." "I wasn't completely alone," I said, glancing at David. "I had Daniel's parents and good friends, and eventually I had David. But yes, I did it without the family I was born into." Diego stepped forward then. "I have children now," he said quietly. "Twin girls, age 8. And I think about them every day, about how I would feel if I had to choose between them and Mom and Dad. I realize now that we should have chosen you. We should have stood by you." We talked for hours that afternoon. They wanted to know everything, about Daniel's illness and death, about David's early years, about my career, about the life I had built from nothing. I told them about the nights I had cried myself to sleep, missing my family. I told them about David's first steps, his first words, his first piano recital, all the moments they had missed. But I also told them about the strength I had found in their absence, about learning to trust my own judgment, about building a chosen family of people who supported my values even when the consequences were difficult. "We were wrong," my father said finally. "What you did wasn't criminal. It was compassionate. It took me almost losing everything to understand that family means standing by each other, especially when the world is against you. The question now," I said carefully, "is what happens going forward. David and I have a good life. We don't need rescuing or fixing. If you want to be part of our family, it has to be because you genuinely want to know us as we are, not because you want to assuage your guilt." "We want to know you," my mother said immediately. "Both of you. We want to be the grandparents we should have been all along." Over the following months, we built a relationship slowly and carefully. My parents came to dinner once a week, attended David's piano recitals, and gradually became part of our lives. It wasn't the same as if they had never left. Too much had happened, too much time had passed, but it was something real and meaningful. David embraced his newfound grandparents with the same generous spirit he brought to everything else. He taught my father to play simple melodies on the piano, helped my mother with her rose garden, and accepted their love without holding their past absence against them. The most healing moment came 6 months later, at David's high school graduation. He had been accepted to Juilliard with a full scholarship, the same path his father had once dreamed of taking. As he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, I looked down the row and saw my parents and Diego cheering alongside Daniel's parents and me. We were all there, the family that had raised me, the family that had chosen me, and the family I had created. It wasn't perfect, and it couldn't erase the years of pain, but it was real. After the ceremony, as we all gathered for photos, David pulled me aside. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said, his voice mature beyond his 18 years. "Not just for raising me, but for standing up for what you believed in, even when it cost you everything. Dad would be proud too." "How do you know?" I asked, tears in my eyes. "Because you raised me to be like him," he said simply. To choose love over fear, compassion over comfort. You taught me that by living it. As I watched my son, Daniel's son, laugh with his grandparents, I realized that the story that began with rejection and exile had become something else entirely, a testament to the power of love to create family where none existed, to build strength from loss, and to transform even the deepest wounds into wisdom. The girl who had been thrown out of her home at 18 was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her own worth, who had built something beautiful from the ashes of her old life, and who had taught her son that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose to love you, stand by you, and help you become who you're meant to be. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to see who you became without them. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they'll be wise enough to be proud of what they see.